Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey Eisenberg, and I'm Falvey Memorial Library's Programming and Outreach Graduate Assistant. On behalf of Joe Lucia, Library Director, and the entire staff of Falvey Memorial Library, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's Scholarship at Villanova lecture. Falvey is proud and excited to provide an extensive lineup of programming as we continue into this fall semester. Tomorrow, we'll host the second installment in our New York Times video conference series. Via web conference, New York Times national editor Richard Burke will discuss the traits of effective leadership. Next Wednesday, October 6th, we sponsor our annual graphic novels event. This year, titled Graphic Novels in the Digital Age, we look forward to welcoming 3 Philadelphia comic book professionals who are changing the way we view the graphic novel. And next Friday, October 28th, Falvey will also host a conference celebrating the centenary of Peruvian writer Jose Maria Arguedas. Information on these and all other library events can be found on our website, library.villanova.edu. Today, we welcome sociology and criminal justice professor Brian Jones for his talk titled, Is American Society Falling Apart?, in relation to his newly published book, Social Capital in America, Counting Buried Treasure. Dr. Jones' original idea for the book was his disagreement with Robert Putnam's best-selling book, Bowling Alone. Dr. Jones believed that the falling apart question might not be as new or black and white as commonly perceived. Here to offer more insight about what has and has not changed about America, please welcome Dr. Brian Jones.
Thanks. Won't be needing that. This all started several summers ago in Borders, a place that used to sell books. I was dealing with my usual puerile pursuits. I walked from the science fiction section to the martial arts section, and I somehow found myself marooned in the adult section, where they sell books for grown-ups. Big, thick, glossy tome caught my attention. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. So I picked it up because I've always found bowling hilarious. And on the book jacket was a coherent expression of the central idea. He said that in America today, more people than ever are bowling, which is a partial answer to that question, by the way. But fewer than ever, a lower proportion than ever, are members of bowling teams with cool satin jackets. So he took that to be emblematic of the fact that association of every kind in America is falling apart. Now, of course, my first sense was, how dare he? First of all, he's from Harvard. Thank you. Second, he's a political scientist. What is he doing trespassing on, well, frankly, my domain? So I flip it open and gulp. This is real data. This is not the usual tomato fertilizer you find in the sociology section at Borders about folk dancing and serial killers, right? Real data, factor analyses, something that will mean something to some of you. But evidence after evidence after evidence of his central, unbelievably simple hypothesis, American society is falling apart. Voting, down. PTA membership, down. He even had data on pinochle clubs. So be disquieted. Pinochle clubs in America, whatever pinochle is, are way, way, way down. Right? Chapter after chapter after chapter. Right? Something about it, aside from his institutional affiliation and his discipline, made me uneasy. Didn't seem right. Didn't feel right. So I started to ask myself, if you were to truly address this question, is American society falling apart? How would you do it? I didn't like the fact that he used an everything but the kitchen sink approach. Right? 3 national data sets, every single indicator of association down. What are the essential structures? What is the real beating heart of America, by which I mean your life and my life? Now, I didn't want to address the public macro structure of America. This is not about democracy. This is not about corporate capitalism. This was about, the title of the book actually, social capital, which I define to mean the social structures that you and I build and maintain to seek the things we value. What are they? What are the essentials? I wanted to get at the guts. Okay, so the structure of our constitutional democracy is like the skeleton. What are the innards? There it is. There is the Brian Jones model of social capital that I've been wanting to build in my basement all these years. Finally, I have 4 elements that I will assert here and remind you later are in fact 90% of where you spend your time and I spend my time. Upper left. Actually, let's go lower left. Family first. All the students of social capital, and I got to tell you, this is a growth industry across the social sciences, not just in sociology. Everybody accepts that component as a key element of the social capital in your life. The cliche is the family is the building block of society, which often sets up straw men about family values. There's a certain amount of evidence that I'm going to show you about the decline of the family in America, but the Monitoring the Future study done by the University of Michigan finds that last year's graduating class of high school seniors, 90% of them aspire to a good marriage. So whatever's happening to the family as an ideal, as an element of people's real lives and real social capital, it's primary. Okay. Upper left, work. This is strange. This is one of the things that made me suspect that Putnam was wrong. He didn't include it as an element of social capital. And how can that make sense? I mean, there are about half of you here are seniors about to confront that terrifying thing called the real world. What are you afraid of? That's what you're afraid of. You're about to go from this, and we all know what this is, but we're not telling anybody, into the real world. Now, I'm not talking about work as a corporation, as a macro structure. I'm talking about work as an office you go to where you have interactions and relations with people on the job. And most importantly, the time you spend there. The phrase I attach to this the most often is American workaholism. We are the hardest working society in the industrial world as measured by average hours a week spent at work by men and women. We passed the Japanese in the year 2000. An aspect of this that I find especially interesting, it dramatizes just how this is a case of, God help me, American exceptionalism. We are the worst vacationers in the world. It's too bad there's not an Olympics. We're the worst. Right? The average American has allocated 13 days of vacation per year. 13 days. The second worst country in the world are the Japanese with 26. They have twice as many as we do, and they're the second worst in the world. The Europeans? My God. French, 38. The Germans, 42. Can you believe it? All right, so what's my point? My point is twofold. First, work is a key part of your life and my life at the micro-personal level where we live. And This is an area in which we have enormous commitment as a society. All right, anybody seen the jacket? Okay, upper right. The only thing on this projection that could qualify as a sociological buzzword, voluntary association. And it used to be a buzzword. You know, before all of this social capital talk, frankly, before bowling alone, only about 8 people in this room even knew what the hell it meant. Now you Google voluntary association. I did it last night. 8.1 million hits. People know what this means now. And it's surprising because the term comes from a really old dead French guy. Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1830. He was trying to tour the one society on the planet that was a working democracy. He came from France. As of 1830, France was having some trouble. And they had been for about 30 years. You know, forget all these slasher movies with the word Saw in the title. You want to see real horror stuff? Go read about the French Revolution. They were inventing new devices to kill people. That's what the guillotine was. So it was a real question, especially with Napoleon declaring himself emperor. It was a real question that the French would ever have a working democracy. How does this thing work in America? So he toured the country, small towns, big cities. What he found, what he said, is that America is, quote, a nation of joiners. They find groups for every purpose and support, is what he said. By comparison to France, where you pretty much had the state and just a bunch of neighbors, in America we form, well, voluntary associations. Community groups at the church, community groups at the schools, community groups, community groups, community groups. It's still true. For Tocqueville, it was an assertion. Cross-cultural comparisons find that America is either number 1 or number 2 in the world in terms of its extent and quantity of voluntary association. I see the looks on your faces. Who cares? Well, you really should care. Now, this was really the centerpiece of Bowling Alone's argument. You know, all those bowling groups that have folded, all those groups of every kind that have folded, if voluntary association in America is really drying up, it's bad. One of the most persuasive chapters of that book that I bought completely was him assembling all the evidence showing that levels of participation in community groups are powerfully related not only to personal welfare, people who join a lot of groups are happier and better off, but community welfare too. And if you have any doubt of it, just take a tour of Lancaster Avenue. What you'll find as you go from here to Philadelphia, you know Philadelphia, the city to the east, what you'll find is that you are descending the class structure. As you go from here, we're at the apex, into Ardmore, middle class, through Upper Darby, Overbrook Park. What's happening? The neighborhoods are getting worse. The levels of voluntary association decline too. Right here, lots of church activity, lots of community groups of every kind, scouting groups, less neighborhood association, less neighborhood welfare. Okay, so not only classically, but in terms of current evidence, voluntary association is a big thing. If it's down, we're all down. Okay, lower right, social networks. This is where I've spent most of my career. You're not going to believe this, but social networks was actually a meaningful phrase before 1985, before social networks became attached to the computer. What I've done is I've studied the impact of friends, relatives outside the household, and neighbors. And the evidence here is excellent that the people who do more of it, they live longer, they're happier, they're more successful at work. Social networks are important. Personally, if they're in decline, we've got a problem. Okay, so this is my long-winded answer to the question of, if you really wanted to figure out if America is in decline, how would you gauge it? Where would you look? I think these 4 zones are the primary criterion, the innards of America. So what's happening? Let's talk about family first. All my other data come from the General Social Survey. Here I decided to use census data because it stretches all the way back into the 1920s. Let's talk about the green line first, since that's the one everybody wants to talk about. That's the divorce rate. That's the number of women per 1,000 who are divorced in a particular year. Now, notice you get, from 1960 to 1980, a clear 20-year upward trend in the rate. Now, this is not just a count of divorces. This is the rate. This is the risk of divorce. This is the percentage of people getting divorced. It peaked in about 1980. Somewhat to some people's surprise, the divorce rate in America is actually down. But, as I often say, it's much worse than that. If you want to look at family life as a source of personal investment in social capital, you got to look at the blue line. The blue line is the marriage rate, the number of women per 1,000 who are in intact marriages in a given year. Look at that. Here's the big post-war pre-baby boom phenomenon. You all know what that's about. Well, let's track it from over here. Notice that the marriage rate is down virtually every year across certainly all your lifetimes, and even a big chunk of my lifetime. Which means what? Well, it means people are getting married later. When I graduated from college in 1972, I got married that year. I was 22, my wife was 21. To the young people here, that sounds like a perversion, doesn't it? All right, you get married much later now. Not only has the marriage rate, the age of marriage been delayed, but a lower percentage of people than ever get married. The statistic that I found most shocking as I started to unpack the General Social Survey data on this question was this. In 1972, the first year of the General Social Survey, 75% of American adults were in intact marriages, 3 out of 4. 2008, the last data I have available to me right now, 48% of current American adults are in intact marriages. It went from 3/4 to less than half in just a little bit more than one generation. To a sociologist, and there are several present, this is a seismic shift that happened at incredible speed. So the way I interpret it in terms of my model is to say that this far, Putnam is right. We are, in fact, investing less in family life than we did in 1972. So he gets a big down arrow in that one zone. As though to compensate, here's the trend in work hours. How many hours did you work the previous week? Each dot represents an average by decade. It's an analysis of variance projection. The increase is not just for women. Everybody knows a lot more women's work since the 70s. It's obvious. Tens of millions of women pouring onto the full-time labor force. It's up for males. It's up for young people. If you look at hours worked per week for people over the age of 65, that's up. However you break down the data, and I've done it myriad ways, the trend line is up. We're working more and more. It's not just American workaholism. It's workaholismization. It's getting worse and worse and worse every year. Actually, I could separately break out the trend lines for college students. It's like a roller coaster hill. Right? So the increase, that's the average. The increase for college graduates, much faster and continuing, right through the so-called Great Recession. Okay, so we have been de-investing in family life in America, but increasing our personal investments in our jobs, in our careers, at work. All right, Voluntary Association. General Social Survey offers a smorgasbord of 16 different kinds of groups. And respondents on that survey check them off. So there's veterans groups, there's school groups, church groups, 16 different kinds of groups. And the interviewer asks people which ones they're currently members of, and they check them off. Okay, so what we have here is a representation of the average number of community groups people belong to outside their family and outside their job. Right, so these are truly voluntary. The dots represent averages from the 70s to the 80s, a little bit of a decline, surge up in the 90s, drop off in the 2000s. There's actually some technical problems with that survey I won't get into, but just look at it. Does that look like a cascade to you? Does that look like the bowling alone phenomenon is pervasive? All right, there is a slight drop off from left to right, but I think it's misleading even though it doesn't seem to show much. The biggest single group participation that has dropped over the past 35 years? Unions. So, a much lower percentage of Americans are in unions than they were in 1972. Do you think that's happened because people have become less interested in association? No. I mean, over this period, the city of Philadelphia lost 250,000 manufacturing jobs. A lot of them were good union jobs. You know, Breyer's Ice Cream in Southwest Philadelphia, those jobs are in Mexico, in Taiwan. They're all over. They're not here anymore. People did not withdraw from union participation because of a lack of interest in joining with other people. It's up at that level of industrial capitalism. So even though this doesn't show much of a decline, to me, it's actually, if you take out the union thing, the line is dead flat. No change at all. Okay, let's get to your personal life and my personal life. A lot of action here. Okay, the General Social Survey item, it's a little unusual. It doesn't say how often do you hang out with. It says, how often do you spend a social evening with relatives outside your household? How often do you spend a social evening with relatives outside your household? So this doesn't mean you sit down with your husband and watch TV. It means you leave the house, you go to their house, you get a sitter, you go out to a movie, spend a social evening. It's a real commitment. Now, for both males and females, 70s to 80s, precipitous drop. Not too surprising, right? Divorce rate was going through the roof. It continued a little bit for males. It starts to flatten out here. Now, look at the dots on the right compared to the dots on the left. Americans are visiting their relatives more than they ever have, even though they are less invested in household family life. There's more visiting with relatives in the aughts than there was in the 70s. So you had to track down and then it's recovered. So people now do a lot of interaction with their relatives. Okay, here is, it hurts me to admit it, here is another instance in which Putnam is right. Neighboring in America has fallen off the table. Over a sustained period, believe me, these are not little statistical blips. These are substantively important declines. Neighboring in America is down, down, down. Starting to flatten out over on the right, but still went down from the 90s into the aughts. Now, I've spent a lot of time speculating in my book and in my classes about why this might be. Here is the naked truth. I don't know. I spent an entire summer on my back porch monkeying with microcase, controlling this variable, controlling that variable. It's everywhere. The air in neighboring in America has gone out of it since the 70s at an incredible rate. At the end of this presentation, for those who remain conscious, I will ask you to explore this mystery with me a bit. Over the same period, there has been a sustained but significant increase in friendship interaction. So people slowly but steadily are spending more time, decade to decade to decade, going out with their friends. Spend a social evening with friends. Okay, and this is distinct from relatives and neighbors. That's the way the question is worded. So we are doing somewhat more friendship interaction. We decayed in our participation rates with kin for a while, but have recovered. But neighboring, off the table. Neighboring in America is not gone, but it's going fast.
How can I understand the value on the y-axis?
No, you can't.
Okay.
It's a composite index. The numbers don't really mean anything. But it's how often you go out with it, basically. Okay.
But so from slide to slide to slide, though, it's comparable. So like the neighbors were between 2 and 3, and this was between 2 and 4. So that's comparable at least.
Yes.
Slide to slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Each index is the same.
Okay.
It's actually a 12-point scale.
Okay.
Mathematicians. Okay. Now, as I continued to dig and tried to explore the mystery of how Putnam could be, frankly, so wrong, I discovered the key piece missing from the puzzle was education. Not quality of education, but quantity. And whether you go to college or not. The percentage of Americans over my adult lifetime, and certainly yours, who have participated in college life has increased pretty much year to year. So what? Well, here I've got 4 panels that reproduce my model. And look what they show. This is less than high school. These are people who have not finished grade 12. High school grads and people with at least some college. That's what the dots are. Hours worked per week. Look at that. Now here I broke it down just for the surveys in the aughts, 2002, 4, 6, and 8. People who go to college on average work a lot more hours than people who go to high school, who work a lot more than people who didn't finish high school. Family life. Whether you look at marriage, whether you look at a separate subcategory of married with kids, people with college degrees are more likely, on average, across the board in adult America, to have higher levels of family commitment. Voluntary association. Huge effect. Okay, now remember, I'm not talking about being on the debating team while you're in college. I'm talking about American adults. All right, this is a sample of America, including people at the vast age of 61, who join a karate association or something, right? So, adults in America, didn't finish high school, have the lowest rates of voluntary association. High school grads, big jump up. Biggest jump up, college. And this is another of the emergent mysteries that wouldn't fit into my slim little volume. Something about what you're doing right now, students, is going to mark your soul so that 30 years from now, you are significantly, and I mean significantly, the F was over 100, significantly more likely to join all kinds of local community groups. It'd be an interesting study in the sociology of education to figure out why that happens. Okay, down here, as my representative of social networks, I have confidants. That's a specific item in the general social survey that I think is very meaningful. It's worded this way. How many people are there with whom you could discuss important personal matters? How many people are there with whom you could discuss important personal matters? This is not some crude, how many friends you got? These are people who you care about interpersonally, you could depend on in a crisis. Look at the effect line. I mean, this is all, no matter what measure of social capital I look at, it is vastly amplified by education level. So, as we see from the upper trend that the average years of schooling of Americans have massively increased over our lifetime, the little comic book light bulb went on above my head. This is how Putnam was wrong. What he did is in his regression equations, he controlled education. He took out the effects of education. So it looks like everything's going down. That's a case of specification error. The truth is, in fact, in the real America, education has been stacking up over this period. So you have to look at its effects. Final panel. People who went to more school, on average, are happier as adults than people who went to less. And I even broke it down, not high school, junior college, BA, graduate degree, hard to believe with PhDs, but it's true. Each dot is higher than the one to its left. Something about what you're doing now is going to impact you inside later in your life. And after the previous panels, this shouldn't really be a surprise. The fact is, educated people have more of every kind of social capital, so of course they're happier. Okay. Now, when I'm not standing up and talking loud in front of people, my main gig is working on this social capital stuff. So, honest to God, last week, I came up with what I think is a genuine discovery I want you to help me with. It's good to hear the suspense build as I fumble around with this thing. One of the big current issues in this whole area has to do with, I guess you could call it computer nerdism. There is a pervasive myth, and I'm going to call it a myth, that we are all changing into an America in front of our screens, withdrawing from social life, gaming, spending all of our time online. Now, this turns out to be totally incorrect. A number of high-profile studies, two of them conducted by the Pew Center and one by Stanford, have shown that if you look at people who don't go online and people who do are much more associative. They're much more involved with community groups. They're much more involved with their personal networks, too. But I think those studies are dated. I think you have to look not just at whether you're online or who's not online. There's still a little digital divide, but it's almost gone. You've got to look at how many hours a week they spend doing it. That's what I did here. On the x-axis, these are people who spend 0 to 5 hours a week online, either email or visiting websites. The dot is here. The y-axis is, I call it total socializing. If you add up all the time they go out with friends, relatives, and neighbors, total amount of time they go out, that's what it is. Notice the steep increase for the 6 to 12ers. People who are online 6 to 12 hours a week, way up there in terms of their levels of association. Now, there's a lot of variation here. We all know people who do seem to be online for, well, actually, I don't know if you can see it, but in the lower right there, I had one respondent that said 120 hours a week online. Right? So there's extreme amounts here. But I mean, look at how, well, frankly, look at how neat that is. It clearly shows, and I spent the whole week verifying it, looking at males and females, looking at different levels of education, ages. It traces out the same inverted V shape. Moderate levels of going online are associated with maximum socializing and also maximum group participation. Above about 12 hours, though, you get a drop-off. So it's like 1 or 2 hours a day. Those people go out more than anybody. More than that, and you get a drop. Okay. Do me a favor. Can you hit the switch there? Get the lights on. All right, that concludes the prepared presentation, but you're not done yet. 2 mysteries I want to explore. That's one, but let's go back to the neighboring thing. Okay, because that's the clearest demonstration of the erosion of social capital over the past 30 years. What has happened to our neighborhoods? Why is neighboring in America way down? I mean, several standard deviations down. And why is it continuing to drop? Because we work more, right? Is that what you guys think? Yeah.
I have a question. Do people move more? So they don't like.
I
they're not
checked
in the same
that. I
neighborhood,
spent
they
a
grow
whole
up
summer
more?
doing this, damn it. And actually, people don't move more. I thought it just might be that there's more movement because of, moving to the Sun Belt or something. No, it's not that. And there's even an item in the GSS. I checked it. Didn't make any difference. Yeah. Dr. Arborite, speak up.
We moved to bigger properties out of the suburbs, where you drive in, hit your garage
Yes.
quicker, and
And if that held a shred of water, you'd expect there to be a bigger drop in the suburbs than anywhere else, right?
bigger drop in the suburbs.
Well, because now we have more McMansions and less space. Actually, neighboring has dropped in the suburbs, in rural areas, and in the cities. Everywhere. Not as much in the cities, but it's definitely down each decade there, too.
And it could possibly be related to a greater subjective fear of crime and going out.
No.
Okay, well, try.
Well, I mean, there's enormous, some of the people sitting next to you could tell you there's been enormous variation in crime over this period.
No perception.
Well, hard to check, but if you look at things like TV viewership, which is a big deal for Putnam, doesn't seem to have an effect. Bob?
One of the things
Children's
that-
free
One of
time.
the things that Putnam points out is, or he argues, is it has to do with growing diversity.
Heterogeneity.
And people, like in his words, they become turtles, the head goes inside the shell, because they don't want to associate with people that are.
Yeah, the latest version of Putnam's argument is that heterogeneous communities, where it's not all just people like you, suppresses social capital. But again, I think he's pulling a deft move there, because I don't think there's been an increase in heterogeneity in American neighborhoods. Do you?
Yeah, it has, diversity is.
Well, racial segregation hasn't dropped.
Free playtime for children. Children bring parents together. Parents work all day. Children are in daycare or after school activities, so they have less time to socialize on the street, play on the street.
Well, how about play dates? Didn't you all have like
But
play
not
dates?
in the neighborhood anymore. You drive them to their school trips.
Well, that would still be neighboring, unless it's a whole different neighborhood. Yeah. Actually, what Putnam thought was that women working was behind a lot of this. Turns out not to be. Women who work, in fact, get this, people who work 60 hours a week neighbor more than people who work 40. So I guess one message here is social capital in America is complex. You can't just paint the down arrow all the time.
What's the operative of neighboring?
How often do you spend a social evening with your neighbors?
So face to face.
Face to well,
Not on the phone.
not on the phone, not online, not in the driveway with your SUVs.
Neighbors wouldn't include workmates?
That's not clear. In fact, one of
That
my
would be a big thing if people
one of my
were-
working hypotheses now is that people are substituting coworker relationships for neighboring relationships. But so far, the data is not good enough to answer that question. Let's try this question. Why are moderate levels of online commitment associated with higher levels of association and social capital? I have an idea what's going on. I want to hear what you guys think. Yeah.
I don't find this counterintuitive at all.
Well, good for you. Tell us why not.
It just makes perfect sense.
Well, let's hear how it makes
You
perfect sense.
Consider what people may be doing when they're online, is they may be fostering their social relationships up to a point. Past
So
that
they're setting
point-
up the PTA meeting.
setting up dates. They're online getting dates and stuff.
Right.
And now they're
Okay.
doing my whatever.
I'm with you so far, which is unlikely anyway. But how about
That knows what I mean.
why the drop-off?
See, I think there's a fundamental issue here, though. You're never going to know this stuff unless you get away from this kind of quantitative assessment. You got to go talk to people. Say,
Right.
can you do that? Will you do that, please? I'm busy. So.
I thought this was your job.
No. You started. Just keep going. Because you're going to drive yourself crazy.
I think what might be going on is a kind of substitution effect, that after a certain point, people are in fact going online because they don't have enough friends, or they don't have enough association. Actually, the clearest drop-off is for interaction with relatives. So I think people may be substituting interaction with their relatives, emailing their grandparents in California maybe. But anyway,
That's a good thing.
this pervasive idea that the computer is destroying social capital and making people social isolates is complete bunk. All right, it's much more complicated. Okay, somewhere in there I showed you a demonstration that more education is associated with more happiness. What we did here today could be construed as an educational activity. So at some point in the immediate future, you're going to feel an infinitesimal bump in happiness. Thanks, everybody.